part about the Ypsilanti State Hospital and the Three Christ, because that's just something that's recent for me that I could tell you all about it without mentioning those three guys, other than the fact that they were delusional.
Uh-huh.
All things about Christ are delusional. It's the story, it's the conceptualization from Christianity with the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And so when the Christians talk about Jesus, they generally are talking about their version of the Son of God, as opposed to a wandering mendicant.
But this is usually, not necessarily always, right?
Well, let us say that from time to time, the real Jesus does sneak in the back door of Christianity, but he'll be grabbed by the scruff of the neck once he's on display and tossed right out again.
Do you think this happens with every religion then?
Yes, it certainly has happened to Buddhism, and it happened big time with Islam.
So they take the main prophet and then they package it in a way that tries to recruit the most amount of people in the case of the religions that are actively recruiting or missionary. But I don't think Buddhism is actively recruiting as much as Christianity.
Well, it's more subtle. It's more subtle in its proselytization.
Apostolization, nice. Okay, that's it's delusional. When Christians talk about Jesus, they talk about Christianity. Okay.
All right. Jesus himself, first off, let's say this. Whether the Jesus of the three synoptic gospels was a real individual person with all of those characteristics, never mind about his birth story, but the teachings, the words he said, the red letter edition of the Bible, that's all the red letters, that you take out everything in black and leave only the red letters, only the actual words of Jesus. And now we've got something to work with. This is, in fact, what is called the Jeffersonian Bible.
Jeffersonian?
Yeah, Thomas Jefferson, the
Mm-hmm.
famous American who became president and signatory of the many things, keeping slaves all the while. That Jefferson wrote his own Bible, which basically was nothing much more than a red letter edition. So let's talk about that as Jesus, as opposed to an actual historical character whom we're not sure actually existed. But if he did not exist, then what we find there is, from that period of time, an amalgamation and a lifestyle that did exist, whether it was by the name of Jesus or not. And so when we're talking about Jesus, we're talking about a full-on concept rather than an individual who sprang those concepts.
So Jesus is also a concept in this case then.
Well, the Dhamma is a concept when it's being spread. And that's the whole point, is it has to be taken out of conceptualization into experiential. It has to be experienced. But it's spread as a concept. It's spread as information, as words, either on a paper or through the ear to the ear.
So you're saying that it's better. So the conceptualization of Jesus is not good, but it's the experientialization of it what
No,
is
I
useful.
wasn't referring to Jesus as that point. I was merely talking more about the Dhamma,
Okay.
in the sense that everything is information, not in practice. All of the words are on paper. They're not in action. They have not been realized. That at best they are only mentalized.
Okay.
And when you describe your experience to someone, you put it back into words, back into concepts, and because we normally transmit data or transmit information as information.
Okay.
That we don't, if there is a language of feeling, then that language of feeling and experience would be music, not words. Or perhaps maybe music with lyrics.
Dance?
So that
What about dancing?
dancing,
Yeah.
all right, that's also an experience, normally done, but not necessarily done with music.
Okay.
Then, in fact, one of the ways of dancing without music is by dancing your whole life and just dance.
Yeah,
Dance away.
you can have your own soundtrack inside your head.
But that soundtrack, again, it depends upon if there's lyrics or not.
Okay. I think
The lyrics then are going to be the conceptualization, but the dancing or the experience is what is needed to be conveyed, and we don't have proper language to do that.
okay.
Now, in the time of the Buddha, the reason why the Buddha was against music, just as a side point, was because the kind of music that was available in his day was either tinky music, or it was war or jungle drums. That those were the two kinds of music. Neither one of them, let us say, is evoking the kind of experiential evoking that that music is capable of. But in those days, in that place, it was still too primitive and not sophisticated the way that, say, Tchaikovsky's Six, or Beethoven's Ode to Joy, or Pavan. I don't know if you know that. Or in the same line of evoking experience would be James Brown. I feel good. Like I know I would now. Okay. So that actually is the words, but the words I feel good now, like I knew I would now, when said like that, don't have the real meaning. You've got to dance and put it to music to convey the actual meaning. So if he merely recited "I feel good now" like I knew I would now, as if he were reading or reciting a poem, hoping that the concept alone is going to evoke the emotion, and sometimes poetry can do that. But poetry does that, again, with rhythm and meter and rhyming and other things. So that's how the emotion is done. Now, in normal language, we try to convey meaning in the sense of feeling through techniques. Those techniques would be over dramatification, being a drama queen. Not in the literal sense, but in the general way of doing it. Grandiosity. Saying I really had a hard day at work, rather than it was a hard day, we say it was miserable. That when there's a line of people that we talk to and we have to see 10 or 12 people, by the time we tell the story, it was hundreds. Even words like million and billion are often used merely as grandiosity rather than as actual numbers or figures meaning something. It's almost always done like, wow, that company's got 1,000,000 problems. Now, the funny part about it is in the time of the Buddha, they did have some number like that. The number was, in fact, 500. So whenever you see 500 this and 500 that, that means a large collection is uncountable. That could be someplace between 200 and 1,000 or more.
Oh, like the Christians would say, you have to forget 70 times 7.
Right,
Where
49.
where 7 is
Here's
just...
something about that with with Donald Trump. Numerous problems, and more than that, 14,000 lies. How many, registered knowable lies that he's told? How many times are the Christians going to forgive him?
Yeah.
70 times 7 doesn't even begin to count the number of
Yeah,
it.
they've run out of them. Yeah, it's definitely more than 490.
I've got another student coming in. No, I'm not going to call. I'm not going to answer her because she doesn't want to be recorded. So we'll just leave it. So back to we were talking about concepts. We got off onto music and all of that. Basically, what we're looking at is that Jesus, whoever Jesus was trying to convey meaning through concepts that he hoped would become understood by the people who were around him, and he kind of didn't get anywhere with them.
What do you mean he didn't get anywhere with them?
Well, when the cock crows 3 times, Peter proves that he wasn't up to the scratch of Jesus. They fell asleep while he was sitting up meditating all night. They called it prayer in the Bible, but you know what he was doing? Doing anapanasati. Getting his head together, knowing that tomorrow he shall die.
Mm-hmm.
And that could have been figured out. I mean, it was only a week before, so it looks like in the scriptures that he had gone into Jerusalem, into the temple, and thrown out the money changers. The money changers? Well, of course they're going to go right after him. He's messing with the religion's capabilities of making money, which is the only reason for a religion, is to fleece the sheep. And so the money changers of the temple are now Christianity.
Okay.
And that many people would say if Jesus came back and took a look at Christianity, he'd throw the whole crap into hell. Actually, he doesn't have to throw them anywhere. They already are.
Yeah, it's about to disappear. So, okay, so you're saying that Jesus needed to had a message that was experiential, but
Yes.
failed to properly conceptualize and pass it on, which is why it failed. And so is the Jeffersonian Bible an effort to maintain the experiential Jesus and not
Well,
and aim to avoid the conceptualization or the over conceptualization of this message?
well, as far as him being a failure at delivering his message, let's contrast him to the life of the Buddha for just a moment, which
Okay.
is actually well known and well documented. Jesus was very poor.
Uh-huh.
The Buddha was from a wealthy, very, very well-connected family. And his father was elected to office for 20 years. And so they would call him a king because he was actually named Raj.
Okay.
But it was an elected office. But he was powerful and important. Another thing was Jesus himself was very well connected, because we know when he left the palace that he took his own teacher and a groom for his horse, and several other people left with him. And that we also know that he left with full permission and understanding by his father and his mother, that it was only the wife who was ticked off. She was pregnant at the time. And so the story of him going out, sneaking out of the palace, that he was somehow cloistered in the palace, was not true. Because we know that, in fact, he couldn't have been cloistered in the palace. He was trained as an archer. He was trained as a warrior. He was trained in elephant care and in horse care. He used animals like horses and elephants as if he had deep knowledge of them, because he uses them as examples in the sutras about how the human mind works. So we know all of this about him, and yet the story of him being cloistered in the palace because his father was afraid of the prophecy becoming true doesn't make any sense. That if his father wants him, he was going to be called either a wheel-turning monarch in the sense of a very powerful warrior king, perhaps an emperor, who expands his father's territory, or he's going to be a wheel-turning mendicant, a Buddha. And that his father didn't want him to be a Buddha, he wanted him to be a warrior. Well, being cloistered in the palace looks like he really actually wants him to become a mendicant, especially since he gave him such an excellent moment. But the point is that the Buddha had a very, very rich undertaking, very rich education, and that the teacher that he had been with was a Brahmin who was well known. He was older than the Buddha, but he's the one who taught him meditation when he was a kid. And then he went out with the Buddha and spent 6 years with him, and then was there at the first sermon, and then became the first one who understood the teaching of the Buddha, and stayed then with the Buddha as the Sangha grew, until it became very powerful, and that this original teacher now was kind of set aside because both Mahamangala and Sariputta were now the deans of the colleges, the teachers. And so he left and went into retirement. But that's the life of that teacher. I've forgotten his name right now. I could look it up and send it to you later. So the name, this teacher then was an avenue through which the Buddha knew all of the Rig Vedas. He knew all of the literature of the day. He was well schooled in the Brahmin system, and he was also then introduced to the very best teachers in the biggest schools in the entire vicinity. And so the Buddha was well educated. He went to the very best teachers. Hang on a second. Okay. Okay. So the life of the Buddha and the life of Jesus were completely different. The Buddha was familiar with royalty. He had two students. One was King Bhamiputra in the west, and the other one was King Pasenadi in the east. Not Bhamiputra, that's King of Thailand. Bimbisara. Well, what an interesting point. Okay, so Bimbisara then was the great-great-great-grandfather of King Ashoka, the emperor who then held the Third Council in 300 BC, and that's when Buddhism really started to spread strongly. But it was kept alive simply because it had very, very good connections. Another point is that the Buddha taught for 45 years. So he had a set of skills that Jesus didn't have, and he had time to teach, and he had connections that Jesus didn't have. But basically, they taught the same thing.
So do you think that it was because Jesus was less connected and preached for much less time, his message was more deformed over time as
I
opposed
would
to
go
the
so far
Buddha?
to say he made a major mistake. He went into the temple and he cleaned house, and he was nailed up for it within a week.
Wait, what?
I said he was nailed up for it within a
Oh,
week.
because he was just too aggressive, you think?
Right, of course. The Buddha wouldn't have gone into a temple and cleaned house, not blow the money changers out. He'd have gone right to the head dude, the top priest, who would have probably already known who the Buddha was. They would have sat down and have a conversation, and then that head priest would take that whole temple, including the money changers, and convert them to the Buddhist.
Hmm. So it's a bad strategy. Hmm. So if the Buddha would have been that dramatic, he would have been also, do you think, crucified or taken care
No,
of?
he was poisoned.
Oh, that's how the Buddha.
Pardon?
Is that how the Buddha died? I didn't know. I
Yeah, he
didn't.
was poisoned.
Interesting.
And there
But
are still monks who will stay up all night arguing with each other whether it was an intentional poisoning and who actually did it. The fact is that we can't even actually decide what it was that was the poison. But it took him about 3 days to die.
that's a lot.
He was sick. And that way, it could have been more natural poisoning. And if somebody really wanted to do it, they would have done it right.
Yeah, no, 3 days
So
is not. It's not super effective. Hmm.
So that was also at the age of 80, and by then he was well established because he started teaching at the age of 35. And that in fact his brother cousin Ananda was the king after him, and after he retired as king 20 years later, he joined the Buddha, as well as basically the whole family did, to where Jesus shunned his family.
I thought I thought the Buddha had also left his family to live by him to because he had a wife and kids, right? He had a
He
wife and
had
a
a
kid.
he had a wife
Uh-huh.
who was pregnant. After he became enlightened, about 2 years after he became enlightened, when the child was 7 years old, um, he went home and was well received by again everyone, especially his father was so happy to see him. But again, the wife, she was the one who was ticked off. And so she said to her son, and this was her grand mistake, go seek your inheritance from your father. Now, what she was talking about was the royal heritage. See, she stayed in the palace. She was still treated like a princess, but she resented that he had left. And so she said to her son, you go get your inheritance from your father. That was the wrong thing to say because he did. The Buddha took him in, he ordained him, he gave him a robe, he gave him a bowl, and he gave him the teaching. That was the inheritance that the Buddha gave him. So the wife lost both of them.
Hmm. Wait, so he left when she was pregnant, and then he came back when he was 7?
Then he came back when he was 7 and took the kid with him.
So he was gone for 7 years.
He was gone for 7 years, but he was still greatly friends with all of his family except for the wife.
Okay.
And I think that, in fact, I'm not sure, but I do know that the woman who raised him, his mother died in childbirth. The king had already married 2 twin girls. One of them was the mother of the Buddha. When she died, then the caretaker was her sister. Okay, so he was raised by his aunt, but his aunt also had a child, and that child was Ananda, who was about the same age. So they were raised together as brothers, though they were actually half brother and cousin. They had the same father, but they had different mothers. A brother by a different mother, so they say.
Yeah, I have a few of those. Wow.
Okay, so that's the situation. Now let's get back into Jesus, because
Uh-huh.
now we've got someone to contrast him to, and I've already let out the full punchline, is that Jesus taught basically the same thing that the Buddha taught. He just did not have the same skill set nor the time frame to do the teaching that the Buddha had. In other words, while Jesus only had time to do the baiting, Buddha had the time to do the bait and the switch.
What do you mean the bait and the switch?
Well, the baiting is to become very close friends with those whom you want to convert, like going in instead of going in and messing with the money changers in the temple, to go right to the head priest and make friends with him, and then begin to teach him the Dhamma, which is what the Buddha did. He converted nearly every religious leader around. That, in fact, there was one old Brahmin who got really ticked off because he gave a question to each one of his students, 16 in all, to go to the Buddha to ask questions. And when that student went to ask the question, Buddha answered it in such a way that now the student wants to become a student of the Buddha. Then each one of them in turn comes back to the old Brahmin teacher to report what happened. And each one of them tells the story of what the Buddha said to them. This is one of the sutras. So he also went to the fire temple and spent the night with the fire. You know, that whatever, I don't know why, but somehow fire temples always have snakes intentionally. So he spent the night with the snakes.
Fire temples?
Yeah, he goes to maybe it was 2 different temples. Maybe there was a temple dedicated to snakes, and so he goes and sits in the snake pit.
But
And
what is
then
a
he goes to the fire temple. But he did convert the head monks, or the head priest at both the the fire snake temple, and all of the students
oh
came to
the
become the students. That's why the organization grew so fast, was because the Buddha would go after the main teachers.
so the fire temple is for Zoroastrianism. Is that the Persian?
Well, Zoroastrianism is old, and was actually there in India.
But so what is a fire temple then? Because if you Google
I
fire
don't.
temple,
All I know is the reference that it was a fire temple.
okay, so apparently fire temples are from Zoroastrianism.
They all, well, maybe not. I'm not sure. I
Okay,
mean, fire is common.
okay, fair enough.
But I have been to fire temples in India
Mm-hmm.
and found that they've always got a fire going. But in order to preserve wood, you can actually put your hands right over the top of it, and you can feel the warmth because the coals are actually covered in ash. But it's still a holy fire. And they had snakes at that temple too. And it was not Zoroastrian. So anyway, that's the point is that Jesus, that the Buddha would go after the head guys and convert them with his bait and switch because he knew Brahmanism so well. He was well schooled in it. And so when whole groups, for instance, he went to the town where the Kalama people were, and they actually went to him in a delegation. And this is the teaching of the Kalama Sutra, where he first talks about the 10 things. Don't take anything because of tradition. Don't take anything because it's literature or written down. Don't take anything because a teacher gave it to you. Don't take things because they're logical. Don't take things because they are the way that people look at things. I got 7 or 8 of them in there. Okay, so basically, that things have to be seen directly through experience, because all you're going to get out of all of that other stuff is concepts that can be misunderstood. But you actually have to experience it. The second part of that Kalama Sutra, the Buddha talks about morality, which is where they already understand. And in fact, there is a line in there which states that not only would you, let us say, renounce or stay away from greed, but you would recommend that for others to do also. That you would abstain from anger and ill will, and that you would recommend others also. So there's a bit of proselytizing right there. That the Buddha actually said that you would recommend to not be ignorant. Well, if you're actually going out teaching to stay out of greed, to stay out of ill will, and to stay out of ignorance, that's the second noble truth. You're right in line for the rest of the Dhamma coming quite along quickly. The end of the sutta for the Kalamazos, there's an interesting word in there. The word is if. If there is another world, and you behave well in this world and keep the precepts in this world, then in that next world, you will be doing well. That's basically the same teaching, not only in India, but it was everywhere up until the time of Jesus, when Paul was saying, oh no, you can't be good. It's not possible for you to be. Only God is good. You've got to go take Jesus as your Savior and pay the company dues. And then in the next world, you'll be okay. But the Buddha says, no, if there is no other world, still you have a wonderful life in this world. But if you do bad, and if there is another world, then you'll go to hell, which is also the teaching of Christianity as well as Buddhism. Or not Buddhism, but actually many Buddhists still believe that, even though the Buddha taught against it. But it says, but if in fact there is no other hell, then you've won on both counts.
In the today and yeah.
Right, because today and tomorrow you are free from the results of your bad actions. So this is one of the sutras where he's secretly pointing out that the Buddhas begin to make the switch now. He's already, right in the first part of it, is he recognizes these fellows, to where some of the other sutras, for instance, there's a sutra where someone has just come from a funeral, and that he wants to know what is the value and effect of the puja at a funeral. Puja, that's all the kind of stuff. For instance, just imagine a funeral in Mexico with all of the puja. Now, the word puja you might not use, but there is ritual, there's ceremony, there's a priest, there's perhaps even someone shaking an incense thing, all kinds of stuff. All right? And so the question is any of that stuff at value? In other words, if someone had fallen down dead right in the middle of town and everybody know it, then they're going to have a great big funeral. But if that same guy fell down dead 10 miles out of town and nobody ever found the body, what's the difference?
Yeah.
That's the question. What does the funeral puja do? And the
I think
Buddha,
it makes it more experiential.
well, here's the point. The Buddha changes it because he knows that the guy is not talking about the funeral he just came from and all the puja. He's thinking about what kind of puja do I want to have at my funeral.
Mm.
And the Buddha converts that into you living a good life, that you refrain from harming others. And so you begin to have your puja now. And so he taught him morality, which is the first teaching of traditional Buddhism. And so that's the puja that you want done for your own funeral, is that you lived a really good life, whether they talk about it at your funeral or not.
But well, I mean, but people always speak well of dead people, right? Nobody really
Yeah, but
says,
maybe they don't even know you're dead.
well, sure. Okay.
Or they found out years later.
There's no puja.
No puja.
Ah, okay.
So that's the whole point is of that particular sutta is that the puja doesn't mean anything. It's how you live your life that is your puja. And so these are the ways that the Buddha would teach. And so now let's start contrasting, or not contrasting, but rather let's start examining some of the teachings of Jesus that the Buddha might himself say. One of them is about the lilies of the field. They don't dress up fancy to go to the temple. That they are adorned enough of their own. That's one of the parables.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, self-aggrandizement or showing off is what Jesus is talking about. He also talked about praying in a closet, where the Buddha would recommend go to an empty hut or the root of a tree, but it's the same point, is go get away from it all. The foxes of the field and the birds have the nests and the foxes have their holes, but the Son of Man has no place to rest his head. What does that mean? It means no ownership of property. It means don't cling to big pieces of land and houses and that kind of stuff as this is mine.
Wait, so if birds have nests and foxes have holes, why can't humans have houses?
Well, humans can have houses. That's a good place to suffer.
So are the birds suffering in their nests?
They do it because if they were not in the nest, they would be suffering more. The whole point of the nest is for safety.
So
because they feel afraid.
Wait, so Buddha is saying that while
Jesus
birds
said that.
Well, okay, Jesus is saying that while birds and foxes have their own place, humans shouldn't have their own place.
No, he didn't say that. He was saying the Son of Man has no place to rest his head. He's not making any recommendations. He's making a point.
Which is that you
Well, he made it in a way that's difficult to understand. If we put it in Buddhist context, perhaps we can understand what Jesus said by that.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Which is what?
Which is that we try to gain sanctuary when there's really none to be found. In other words, we're trying to build our sanctuary because we feel afraid. And so we need a nest. We need a hole in the ground. We need a house to hide in rather than a home to abide in.
So we have transcended the foxes and the birds. Is that what it's saying? That we
No,
don't
I'm
need
trying to draw
nests.
the point that Jesus was teaching things that were far above the people's understanding.
Well, I still don't really get it. So basically, birds have nests, foxes have their holes. So that is where the story goes, right? And then the Son of Man shall
Wait a
not
minute.
doesn't
Why?
have.
Wait a minute. Why? Why do birds have their nest? Why doesn't the bird lay their eggs right out on the ground?
Well, because that's how they protect them from predators, right?
Thank you. That's the whole point. Why do you have your house?
To protect me from other predators.
Right, including worms who
I
can
mean,
be predators,
including, well,
robbers, thieves,
primarily fellow,
politicians, tax
primarily,
collectors.
yes, primarily other humans.
Right, but not only other humans, but if you had lions and tigers or even the neighbor's wildcat,
Okay.
or how about dogs? No, there's a whole lot of reasons to have a house, but it can all be boiled down to one thing: protection from
Uh-huh.
danger. Until you realize that protection from danger is a mental attitude, not a physical abode.
So there are real dangers. Right?
Yes, they're really, but most of them are conceptualizations, not actual real dangers. The real dangers are very few and far between and easily managed.
By having a home, by having a house.
$100 in a tree and some nails and a saw and a hammer will give me as much protection as you'll get with a 10,000 bedroom mansion. 10,000 too many. How about a 10-bedroom mansion?
Okay. Mm,
Maybe some tin sheeting as well as some lumber.
okay. And this is related to the lilies because this is all because of self-aggrandism.
Yes, grandizement, right.
Self-aggrandizement.
Self-aggrandizement is actually part of the structure that we build to protect us from the predators in our mind. That sounds so good it needs to be written down. The self-aggrandizement is the palace that we build to protect us from the predators in our mind. We feel insecure. And so this is where preening comes up. How does one bird, uh, many bird species, the male actually builds the nest? And that the females come by and check it out. Is this guy's nest good enough? Birds do that. Why do humans do it?
Well, because we are animals that succumb.
Right, exactly. We haven't learned a thing.
Well, we do it because we have learned things. We need to
Actually,
learn.
no, we've only learned how to build better nests.
All right, but this is what we know how to do. We don't know how to live without the idea of danger.
Exactly. We don't know how, so we haven't learned the important thing. We might have learned how to build nice nests, but we haven't learned how to feel secure.
Right, but I mean, those it was important at some point. It was important to know that, to learn that. But now it's not important anymore, so we have to unlearn it as humanity.
Right, but you've been given a huge frontal cortex to figure that out, and the birds didn't have that. All they had was the feeling that they needed protection.
Yeah.
Now you have wisdom to see your way through it. And yet most people, they don't. They still act like birds.
Or foxes, or
foxes, exactly.
whatever animal.
Which goes to the next point that Jesus said. That suppose that the grain was thrown out. Some of it's going to find thorns. Others going to find rocky places. Others, the birds are going to eat it up. But occasionally there's going to be seeds who have fallow ground. That's exactly what the Buddha would teach also, that in fact the noble mind is for the few. Nobility, the real wisdom, the turning on of that frontal cortex and waking up to what's really going on is only for the few, not the masses. For the masses, they have religion.
So it was meant to be. So Buddhism was not meant to be for everyone then, or enlightenment is not meant for everyone, or the noble mind is not meant for everyone. It's just for a
I would
few.
even go so far as to start questioning what you meant by meant.
Well, that's what you're saying, right? Like it's only for the fertile
It's
ground.
only for the ones who will look and listen and practice well to wake up and develop the skills that are needed. People will spend huge amounts of time and effort and energy to develop skills for running races, lifting weights, all kinds of sports. But very few of those people who will spend are dancing, learning to play music, learning mathematics to the point of understanding the math behind all of the physics that Einstein knew, etc., like that. But they don't spend the time figuring out how the mind actually works. That at best, what they're doing with neuroscience is showing how various pieces and parts of the mind function so as to put together the whole package called the human mind. And that's actually quite useful information for us Dhamma is to recognize that I am not only mentally compartmentalized and by being so a crowd, but the physical brain is compartmentalized also in basically that same structure. So that we can then gain the skills that we need to bring the mind to a state of unification. Which is fearless.
So how and how hard it is to get to that point then? Because you're talking about all these people who spend their entire lives training for the Olympics or for ballet or
Right.
for
And
the
guess what happened
symphony.
to each one of those guys? They get old, they can't do it anymore. They feel reminiscent and wish they could do it, but the body gets old, then they get sick, and then they die.
Okay.
But they could have spent their time developing better skills.
And by better, you mean not be afraid.
Useful. Right. Useful skills. The skill of fearlessness. The skill of being awake. The skill of taking deep breaths on a regular basis.
Okay.
Skills like joy. Joy is a skill to be developed. And yet, almost always, people experience joy through one of two ways. One, they meditate their way into it without figuring out what they were doing. It just kind of happens. Then they want it next time. Or two, the 40-year-old semi-executive or almost executive, or maybe even the full executive, is so successful and yet dissatisfied with his life, he goes out and buys a Harley Davidson.
But yeah, and that joy will last for.
Not long, unless if he's really lucky, he'll get on that Harley, quit his job, and go riding with the Hell's Angels.
That would be more joyful, for sure.
It's more freedom, at least.
Wait, so
Joy
you
in
can
that
either.
case would be optional skill to be developed.
So joy can either get through meditation or through buying a motorcycle or something like that.
Well, let us put it this way: Harley Davidson in the United States is far more successful than, say, Joseph Goldstein or Jack Cornfield.
Makes sense.
But the motorcycle doesn't deliver the joy. Motorcycles get old sometime by the first payment due date. Sometimes when it doesn't start after it's only a week old.
Yeah, that would suck. Oh shit. I have to start wrapping up because it's getting late.
Oh, well, we haven't even begun to touch Jesus. We've only grabbed hold of his robe, but that was enough for salvation.
I mean,
Faith is good enough.
we've been talking for an hour. I feel like you always say like, oh, we haven't even begun. Well, let's begin. Let's start from the beginning.
Okay, well, let's begin next time. We'll see you.
Okay, sounds good. Bye.
All righty. Never mind. We'll start again.